In 1783, British diplomats gathered in Paris to sign a document that many believed would mark the beginning of imperial decline. The Treaty of Paris officially ended the American Revolution. Britain had just lost 13 of its most important colonies. For more than a century, those colonies had been a major part of Britain's imperial system, producing agricultural goods, supporting Atlantic trade, and expanding British influence across North America. Now, they were gone. To many observers in Europe, the conclusion seemed obvious. The British Empire had suffered a catastrophic defeat. Some believed Britain would never recover its former power. But something remarkable happened in the decades that followed. Instead of collapsing, the British Empire expanded dramatically. By the late 19th century, Britain controlled the largest empire the world had ever seen. It governed territories across North America, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. So how did a devastating imperial loss lead to an even larger empire? The answer lies in a transformation that began after the American Revolution. A transformation that fundamentally changed how Britain governed its empire. Britain did not simply rebuild what it had lost. It reinvented the entire imperial system. To understand why Britain had to change its strategy, we need to understand the lesson the American Revolution taught. Before the Revolution, Britain governed its colonies through a traditional imperial structure. Colonies were expected to follow imperial trade rules, obey British laws, and ultimately submit to authority from London. For decades, this system worked. But the American colonies had gradually become something very different from the small settlements they once were. By the mid-1700s, they were thriving societies, with large populations, growing cities, and powerful merchant networks. Colonial assemblies had developed political traditions of their own. Local elites had accumulated wealth and influence. Over time, these colonies became increasingly confident in managing their own affairs. When Britain attempted to tighten control after the 7 Years' War, through taxation and new regulations, tensions escalated. Colonists protested, boycotts spread, political resistance intensified. Eventually, the conflict exploded into revolution. For Britain, the lesson was clear and deeply unsettling. Wealthy settler colonies could become politically powerful enough to challenge imperial authority. Trying to rule them too tightly could provoke rebellion. The American Revolution had revealed a structural weakness in the old imperial system. If Britain continued governing its growing colonies the same way, it risked repeating the same disaster again, and Britain still possessed many colonies around the world. So a new question emerged in London. How do you maintain an empire without provoking another revolution? In the years following the American Revolution, Britain gradually developed a new approach. Instead of trying to tightly control every colony, Britain began experimenting with greater local autonomy, particularly in colonies where large populations of European settlers had established permanent societies. In these places, Britain started allowing local governments to manage many of their own internal affairs. Colonial assemblies gained more authority over taxation and domestic policy. Local leaders began to play a greater role in governing their own societies, but these colonies still remained part of the empire. They continued to recognize the British monarch. They cooperated with Britain on defense and foreign policy, and they remained connected through imperial trade and political networks. This emerging model became known as the Dominion system. Under this system, some colonies gradually evolved into self-governing partners within the empire, rather than territories ruled entirely from London. One of the earliest and most important examples of this transformation was Canada. As we saw when looking at Canada previously, Britain faced a very different situation there than it had faced in the American colonies. Canada had been acquired from France in 1763 and served an important strategic role in North America. Rather than provoking conflict, Britain adopted a policy of accommodation. French Canadians were allowed to maintain their religion and legal traditions, helping preserve stability within the colony. Over time, Britain expanded local political authority in Canada, allowing colonial institutions to develop. This gradual approach eventually led to Confederation in 1867, when Canada became a self-governing dominion within the British Empire. Canada was not yet fully independent, but it governed its own domestic affairs while remaining part of the imperial system. This arrangement demonstrated that powerful colonies did not necessarily need to rebel in order to gain political autonomy. They could evolve into partners within the empire instead. And this idea would reshape Britain's global strategy. However, not every part of the British Empire followed the same path. The empire that emerged in the 19th century was not a single, uniform system. Instead, it was a layered structure with different forms of governance, depending on the nature of each region. Some territories became self-governing dominions. These were colonies with large European settler populations and political institutions similar to those in Britain. Examples included Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and later South Africa. Britain expected these societies to eventually manage their own internal affairs while remaining connected through shared institutions and imperial cooperation. But other parts of the empire were very different. Regions such as India, Kenya, Hong Kong, and Nigeria did not develop as settler societies. They contained large indigenous populations and long-established societies, where European settlers were only a small minority, meaning self-government would eventually place political power outside British control. In these territories, Britain maintained more direct administrative control. Imperial officials governed the colonies, often supported by military forces and colonial bureaucracies. These regions provided critical resources, strategic ports, and access to trade routes that supported Britain's global power. In other words, the British Empire, after the American Revolution, was not one empire, but several systems operating together. Settler colonies moved toward self-government. Strategic territories remained under direct administration, and both parts were connected through a vast network of trade, finance, and naval protection. This flexible structure allowed the empire to expand, while avoiding the rigid control that had contributed to the loss of the American colonies. At the center of this system stood Britain's greatest strategic advantage, the Royal Navy. Throughout the 19th century, Britain maintained the most powerful navy in the world. Control of the seas allowed Britain to protect global trade routes and connect distant territories across continents. British merchants, bankers, and shipping companies operated within this global system. Trade flowed through ports linked to British markets. Capital from London financed railways, infrastructure, and economic development in colonies across the world. In many ways, the British Empire functioned less like a rigid territorial state and more like a global network. Different regions played different roles. Some produced raw materials, others served as strategic military bases. Settler societies developed into autonomous political partners. But they were all connected through trade, finance, naval power, and shared institutions. This system allowed Britain to maintain influence across an enormous geographic area without attempting to govern every territory in the same way. The results were extraordinary. In the decades following the American Revolution, Britain expanded its influence across multiple continents. India became the administrative and military center of British power in Asia. New colonies were established in Africa. Trade networks spread through Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Settler dominions developed in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. By the late 19th century, Britain controlled roughly a quarter of the world's land surface and governed hundreds of millions of people. The empire that emerged after 1783 was larger and more powerful than the one that had existed before the American Revolution. What had initially appeared to be a devastating imperial defeat had instead forced Britain to adapt and evolve. The American Revolution revealed a fundamental truth about empire. Power cannot always be maintained through direct control. Sometimes control creates resistance, and resistance can destroy the system entirely. Britain's response was not simply to rebuild the old empire, it was to create a new one. An empire built not only on authority, but on incentives, cooperation, and strategic flexibility. Canada was one of the earliest examples of this transformation. But it was only the beginning. The reinvention of the British Empire after the American Revolution reshaped global politics for more than a century, and it demonstrates something important about how powerful systems survive. Sometimes the key to maintaining power is learning how to adapt after losing it.